Richard Brooks lifted his wine glass with the easy confidence of a man who knew everyone at the table was listening. "Before we eat," he said with a grin, "I'd like to celebrate my girls." The dining room fell quiet. 20 relatives and family friends turned toward him, smiling beneath the warm glow of Christmas lights. My mother nodded proudly beside him. "My oldest, Victoria, is a regional executive now." Dad beamed toward my sister. "We're all incredibly proud of her." Applause circled the table. Then his eyes shifted to me. "And Lizette," he chuckled, shaking his head as if he were about to tell a harmless joke. "Well, one daughter's an engineer. The other cleans houses so well, we just keep her around as the housekeeper." The room exploded with laughter. Someone at the far end of the table smiled at me sympathetically. "Oh, which cleaning company do you work for?" Before I could answer, my father laughed even harder. "She's very good," he said. "We couldn't afford to lose her." Another wave of laughter rolled across the room. I looked toward my mother. She smiled into her wineglass. Victoria lowered her eyes without saying a single word. I slowly set my fork onto the plate. Dad raised his glass again. "And here's to having at least one daughter who made us proud." I pushed my chair back. The sound echoed through the silent dining room. "Dad," I said evenly, "before you finish that toast, there's something everyone here deserves to know." The laughter vanished. Every face turned toward me. My father blinked once before forcing another smile. "Oh, come on, Lizette," he said. "Don't be so serious, sit down. Everyone knows I'm joking." "No," I replied. "Everyone here thinks you're telling the truth." The room remained perfectly still. My aunt glanced between us uncertainly. "So, you don't actually clean houses?" Dad answered before I could. "She helps people out here and there. You know how she is." I kept my eyes on him. "You answered for me again." That sentence landed harder than I expected. For years, that was exactly how our conversations worked. Whenever someone asked about me, Dad answered first. If someone congratulated Victoria, he could spend 10 minutes listing her accomplishments. If someone asked what I did, he would wave a hand. "Oh, Lizette, she's figuring things out." Or, "She likes practical work." Or, "Engineering is complicated to explain." It had become so normal that even relatives stopped asking. The version of me my parents introduced was always smaller than the person I actually was. I used to tell myself they didn't mean any harm, that they simply admired Victoria more, that someday they would be proud of me too. But standing there, surrounded by cousins I hadn't seen in years and family friends who genuinely believed I cleaned houses because my own father had just said so, I realized something painful. This wasn't carelessness. It was a story, one he had been telling for years. And tonight, he wanted everyone to believe it. Dad laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. "Lizette, honestly, don't ruin Christmas over a little joke." I ignored him. Instead, I looked around the room. My eyes landed on the hallway leading toward Dad's study. The door stood slightly open. Inside, I could see the corner of a large framed engineering drawing hanging on the wall. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I did, because I'd drawn it. Across the dining room, Uncle Michael spoke up. "I've always loved what you've done with this house, Richard. Those renovations a couple of years ago completely transformed the place." For a brief second, my father's expression changed, almost too quickly to notice. He smiled. "Oh, yes, we had some people come in and take care of everything." He moved to refill Uncle Michael's glass before anyone could ask another question. I watched him carefully. He had done that before. Anytime someone mentioned the renovations, he changed the subject. Every single time. The pieces that had never seemed connected suddenly fit together. The introductions, the jokes, the silence, the renovations. the story he'd carefully built. I looked back at him. Can I ask you something? His smile faded. What? I held his gaze. Why do you always leave part of the story out? The room fell completely silent. Dad slowly lowered his wine glass onto the table. For the first time that evening, he wasn't smiling. He stared at me for several long seconds before speaking quietly. What exactly are you trying to say? No one reached for their fork. The Christmas music that had been playing softly in the background suddenly felt much louder against the silence. Dad folded his hands together and forced a laugh. I think Lizette's had a long week, he said, looking around the table instead of at me. You know how work stress gets. A few people smiled politely, unsure whether to laugh again. I remained standing. I'm not stressed, I said. I'm tired. Tired of what? He asked. Being introduced as someone I'm not. His smile tightened. Oh, for goodness sake, Lisette, it was a joke. It stopped being a joke years ago. The room became even quieter. My cousin Emma frowned. What do you mean? I looked at her instead of my father. Every time we have a family gathering, Dad tells everyone about Victoria's career. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Then someone asks what I do. I paused. And before I can answer, Dad answers for me. No one interrupted. I've been called the practical one, the quiet one, the one who likes fixing things, and now apparently the housekeeper. Dad shrugged. I simplify things. You erase things. That sentence lingered over the table. My mother finally spoke. Lisette, your father never meant to hurt you. I turned toward her. Then, why have you never corrected him? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence pulled memories to the surface. Graduating from engineering school, after working evenings and weekends to pay tuition. Receiving my professional license. Starting my own consultancy with 2 colleagues. Every milestone had been met with the same response. That's nice. Meanwhile, Victoria's promotions became family celebrations. I had convinced myself that recognition wasn't important. Yet every holiday, every birthday, every reunion ended exactly the same way. Someone else told my story. And every year, it became a little smaller. Uncle Michael broke the silence. I always assumed Lisette worked somewhere in property management. So did I, another aunt admitted. Dad spread his hands. See, nobody's insulting anyone. People simply misunderstand. No, I replied calmly. People misunderstand because you teach them to. He leaned back in his chair. So what exactly do you want? An apology? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I want you to stop pretending parts of my life never happened. My eyes drifted again toward the hallway. The study door was still partly open. From where I stood, I could see rolled engineering drawings stored inside a brass umbrella stand. Dad noticed where I was looking. Almost instantly, he stood. Who wants dessert? He asked quickly. Your mother's pie is getting cold. The change of subject was so abrupt that several relatives exchanged confused looks. Then Aunt Denise smiled. The renovations really were impressive, she said. Richard, didn't they completely reinforce the lower level? Dad froze for the briefest moment. Yes, we hired good people. I watched him carefully. He wasn't avoiding the compliment. He was avoiding the details. I turned back toward him. Why is it, I asked quietly, that every time someone talks about this house, you change the subject? His eyes narrowed. The room seemed to shrink around us. He looked directly at me and asked, almost under his breath, what exactly are you trying to say? No one answered my father's question. Every face around the dining table turned toward me instead. The laughter from only a few minutes earlier had disappeared, replaced by the kind of silence that made every small sound noticeable. Someone set down a glass. A chair creaked. Even the fire crackling in the living room seemed louder. I took a slow breath. I'm saying everyone here remembers this house being under construction 2 Christmases ago. Several relatives nodded immediately. Uncle Michael spoke first. Oh, I remember. The place looked like a building site for months. And you couldn't use the front entrance, Aunt Denise added. We came through the garage that year. Dad gave a quick nod. That's right. We had a contractor handle everything. I shook my head. No. His eyes snapped toward me. It wasn't handled by a contractor. He frowned. What are you talking about? I managed the project. A murmur spread around the table. Victoria looked at me for the first time that evening. You managed it. I coordinated every engineering inspection. Dad laughed sharply. Lizette helped organize a few appointments. That's all. I didn't even look at him. I reviewed every structural report. Dad interrupted. Because you're interested in that sort of thing. I approved every repair sequence. You were helping. I was responsible. The last sentence landed like a stone. Nobody spoke. Uncle Michael leaned forward. Hold on. He pointed toward me. Now that you mention it, I remember driving by one Saturday. He looked at Dad. She wasn't helping. He turned back to me. You were standing outside with rolled-up blueprints. Another cousin nodded slowly. I remember seeing contractors asking you questions. And didn't they keep calling your phone? Aunt Denise asked. I thought that was odd at the time. Dad immediately waved a hand. They were just being polite. No, I answered calmly. They called me because they needed engineering approval before moving to the next phase. The room grew noticeably quieter. Victoria stared at me. You never told me that. I met her eyes. You never asked. She looked genuinely confused. I thought Mom and Dad hired an engineering firm. They did. I paused. I was that engineer. For a moment, nobody moved. Even Dad seemed unsure how to respond. Then he forced another laugh. She makes it sound much bigger than it was. I looked around the table. Does anyone here know who signed the city's structural completion documents? No one answered. I did. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. Dad leaned forward. Enough. His voice was firmer now. This is Christmas. We're not turning dinner into some courtroom. I agree, I replied evenly. So let's stop pretending. My father reached for his wine glass, but didn't drink. His jaw had tightened. The easy confidence he had started the evening with was gone. Across the table, my mother stared down at her plate. Victoria looked back and forth between us, as though she were trying to fit together 2 completely different versions of the same family. Dad tried once more. Everyone, please. She's exaggerating her role. Without saying another word, I bent beside my chair and picked up my leather bag. The zipper sounded unusually loud. Every pair of eyes followed my hands. I removed one neatly folded document. Without unfolding it, I placed it gently in the center of the dining table. No one reached for it. No one spoke. Everyone simply stared at the paper between us. The folded document sat untouched in the center of the table. No one seemed willing to be the first to pick it up. Dad stared at it for a long moment before looking at me. Don't, he said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was the same tone he had used throughout my childhood whenever he wanted a conversation to end. I didn't move. It's only one document, I replied. It doesn't belong here. It belongs exactly here. A heavy silence settled over the room. Uncle Michael reached toward the paper. Dad's hand shot across the table. Leave it. Everyone looked at him. He slowly pulled his hand back, realizing what he'd just done. I spoke before anyone else could. It's an engineering completion certificate. No one said a word. It carries my professional seal and license number. Dad shook his head. Documents can be misunderstood. They can also be read. My younger cousin Daniel finally leaned forward. If nobody else is going to. He carefully unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the page. The confidence disappeared from his face almost immediately. He looked up at me. It says, he swallowed, lead structural engineer. He turned the page toward the rest of the table. And the engineer of record is. His eyes met mine. Lizette Brooks. Questions erupted from every direction. You designed the repairs. You supervised everything. So Richard wasn't managing it. When did this happen? Dad raised both hands. Everyone calmed down. He pointed toward me. She's making herself sound more important than she was. I answered before anyone else could. If that's true, explain why every contractor called me before making a structural change. He didn't answer. I continued. Explain why I spent every Saturday here for 6 months. Nothing. Explain why I kept disappearing from family events, because inspection deadlines couldn't wait. The room grew still again. Aunt Denise looked toward my father. I remember asking where she was. You always said she was busy with work, Uncle Michael added. I said. Just not the work everyone was told. Victoria leaned forward. Her expression no longer defensive, but genuinely confused. Lizette. I turned toward her. Why didn't you ever tell me? I tried. She frowned. When? The first week construction started. She searched her memory. You told me Dad had everything under control. Victoria slowly looked toward our parents. Then another memory surfaced. I remember calling one weekend. She looked at me. You said you couldn't talk because you were on site. I nodded. You laughed and said you were playing architect, she whispered. I wasn't playing. The realization settled visibly across her face. She had believed the version of events she'd been given, just as everyone else had. Across the table, my mother's hands began trembling. She reached for her napkin. I told your father, she said quietly. Her voice cracked. I told him we should have corrected people. Dad turned toward her. Margaret. She didn't stop. I said the joke had gone too far. A tear slipped down her cheek. He kept saying it didn't matter. The room became painfully quiet. Victoria looked directly at our father. Dad. He avoided her eyes. What aren't you telling us? For the first time all evening, he had no immediate answer. His shoulders, always squared with confidence, seemed to sink. He looked around the room, searching for support. No one came to his rescue. I broke the silence. I never wanted applause. Every head turned toward me. I never wanted anyone to stand up and celebrate me. I rested my hand lightly on the certificate. I just wanted my own family to stop introducing me as someone I wasn't. No one argued. No one laughed. Then I reached into my bag one final time. Instead of another single document, I removed a thick folder secured with a binding clip. I slid it slowly across the polished dining table until it stopped directly in front of my father. The label on the cover was impossible to miss. Property financing agreement. Every eye in the room locked onto it. No one reached for the folder. It rested in front of my father like a question he had spent 2 years avoiding. I placed my hand on the cover before anyone else could open it. I'll explain. My voice was steady. The foundation beneath this house wasn't just settling. It had severe structural movement. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. You all remember the cracks in the walls. Uncle Michael nodded immediately. The dining room ceiling, too. And the front porch, Aunt Denise added, I remember thinking it looked uneven. It was. I looked around the table. The movement was getting worse. Left alone, it would have affected the structural integrity of the house. The room fell silent again. Dad stared at the table, still saying nothing. I opened the folder. Inside were engineering reports, invoices, inspection schedules, bank statements, financing documents, and signed contracts. I slid the first report toward Uncle Michael. It started with this inspection. He read quietly for several seconds before looking up. They recommended immediate stabilization. They did. I placed another document beside it. The insurance company denied the claim. My aunt frowned. Why? They ruled it wasn't covered under the policy. I pulled out another page. After that, my parents applied for financing. I looked toward my father. The bank declined the application. Someone whispered they couldn't get a loan. No. I answered the question before my parents could. They didn't qualify. The room became painfully quiet. I continued. They were preparing to sell the house. That sentence seemed to surprise everyone. Even Victoria looked stunned. You were going to sell it. Dad finally spoke, though barely above a whisper. We didn't have another choice. His confidence from earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. I nodded slowly. I knew what selling this house would mean to them. I looked around the room. So I offered another solution. I slid forward the engineering contract. My company took over the structural design. Then another document. I personally managed every inspection. Another. I negotiated reduced construction costs. And finally, several bank records. When there still wasn't enough money. I paused. I paid the remaining balance myself. A collective gasp spread around the table. Victoria stared at the bank statements. You. She looked at me as though she were seeing me for the first time. You paid for this. I paid enough to keep the project moving. But why didn't you tell anyone? I smiled sadly. Because Mom and Dad asked me not to. My mother's head dropped. They were embarrassed. I looked toward her gently. They didn't want anyone knowing they were struggling financially. She covered her face with both hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I. Dad finally looked at me. I never asked you to stand up here tonight. No. You could have kept this private. I did. I let those words hang in the air. For 2 years. I reached into the folder once more and removed the final agreement. My attorney insisted on this. I laid it on the table. It protects both of us. Uncle Michael adjusted his glasses and read quietly. It's a repayment agreement. I nodded. The money wasn't a gift. It was secured against the property, he said softly. Yes. I looked around the room. I never wanted ownership. I wanted accountability. No one defended my father. Not this time. The documents had answered every question before anyone could ask it. There was nothing left to argue. My mother wiped away tears. I should have stopped the jokes. She looked directly at me. The first time. I nodded. Yes. Victoria pushed her chair back and walked over to me. I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. I believed everything I was told. I know. I should have asked you instead. You should have. She wrapped her arms around me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Across the room, my father remained seated. His wine glass sat untouched. The man who had begun the evening, commanding every conversation now, couldn't find a single sentence. His silence said more than any apology could have. Several relatives began speaking, not to him, but to me. I had no idea. You should have been recognized. We're sorry we believed it. One by one, they crossed the room. Not out of pity. Out of respect, I looked at my father one last time. I didn't stand up tonight to embarrass you. He met my eyes. I stood because I wasn't willing to let another room full of people believe I had nothing to be proud of. He lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my coat. Victoria walked beside me. Then Uncle Michael. Then Aunt Denise. By the time I reached the front door, more family members had joined us outside than had remained at the dining table. For the first time in years, I wasn't following my family's version of my life. I was finally living my own. The months that followed were quieter. My engineering consultancy continued to grow, taking on larger commercial projects and expanding into neighboring cities. I kept my relationship with my parents polite but distant. Trust, once broken over years of small humiliations, couldn't be rebuilt with a single conversation. Victoria and I met for coffee every few weeks. Without comparisons. Without competition. For the first time, we were learning who each other really was. Family gatherings became smaller. There were fewer speeches, fewer performances, and far more honesty. Sometimes losing the role people assign you is the only way to become yourself. That Christmas, I didn't lose my family. I stopped carrying the version of it that only existed as long as I stayed silent.